Hi, it's Mr. G here, and today we're going to be going through 3.1 Demand, Supply, and Equilibrium in Markets for Goods and Services. And so we've learned so far about the whole market system. And supply demand is a very important model for looking at, the whole market system because really that's how a lot of our prices and everything else are derived. And that's how suppliers determine, well, what are we going to produce in this kind of an economy? You remember, command economy, it comes from the government. The government says we produce this much and this much, and they might look at what they think, the demand is, how much they can supply, etc. But a market system essentially is way more impacted by people with demand and supply. How much are they going to demand? How much are they going to supply? And that often drives their prices. So let's have a look at what this means. Well, first of all, we have demand. To have demand for something, you must want the product. So if it's a product, say you don't really like coffee or something, then you're never going to have a demand for the product. You also must be able to afford the product. So I might want a very expensive sports car, but I cannot afford a very expensive sports car. So if I can't afford it, it said I don't have a demand for it. And I also have to be willing to pay the price. Okay? And that's important because, well, if I would get the very expensive sports car if it was $100, but if it's $1 million, I wouldn't get it. So price also plays a factor in all of this. So there has to be all three of these items in order for you to be considered to have a demand for the product. So if I take a Starbucks coffee, I want the product. I can afford the product, and I'm willing to pay the price right now that they're charging for it. If they doubled the price, well, then I might not be willing to pay it anymore. So that is what demand is. Now we have right below here quantity demanded. And a lot of students interchange demand and quantity demanded, but that is a mistake. They are very different in how you have to look at them, and we'll go through that on a graph. Quantity demand is the total number of units purchased at that price. So whatever price it is, that's the total number of basically units that are purchased. So if we go to Starbucks coffees, it's like, well, at a price of $4, this is how many people are willing to buy, and that would be the quantity demanded. Let's look at this graph here. So I have here showing the demand for the whole line. And that's what it is. That's a demand curve. That is considered our demand, the whole line. When we talk about quantity demanded, we are talking about a point on the line, a specific point. And there's all different points that make up this line. There's multiple different points. And so it's the quantity demanded at a specific price. So it is just a point. So we refer to quantity demanded, a point. If we refer to demand, we're talking about the line. So a clear distinction on that students need to be aware of. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to look a little bit more into demand. Now, with demand, we have what's called the law of demand. All right? So the law of demand basically says that as the price increases, generally the quantity demanded, remember that's the total number of units sold at a specific price, will go down. So go back to the Starbucks coffee example. We have, say, Starbucks coffee at $4. Maybe we can sell 100 units a day. Well, now they raise the price to $6. So instead of selling 100 units a day, maybe they'll sell 80 units a day. Those 20 people were like, you know what? I like it at $4. I'm not going to pay $6 for it. How about if they double those Starbucks coffee to $12 a day? Well, then the quantity demanded might go down to 10. There's some people out there who are still willing to pay it, but a lot of people are like, that's just too expensive for just a coffee. Okay? And the opposite is true as well. Well, if the price went down from $4 to 50 cents, well, the quantity demanded will tend to increase. Okay? So people might be like, well, I'm going to get 2 coffees. It's, 50 cents a piece. Doesn't even matter if I drink the full next one. It's, basically cheap. And so we look at that. So that is the law of demand. So we know with demand what happens. Price increases, quantity demanded decreases. Price decreases, quantity demanded increases. And remember, demand is not the same as quantity demanded because an increased demand would actually shift the line. That's not what we're talking about. So it's definitely use the word quantity demanded. You're talking about the points on the line, not the whole line. Now, if we look at this, this is a demand curve. So the part in blue, the D1, notice I put D1, that stands for demand, and it's the first line. When you have multiple lines and shifts, then you can have D1, D2, D3, etc. But I have D1, and if you notice on my graph, I have the y-axis is price, and the x-axis is quantity demanded. This is the way it should be, okay? Price is always on the y-axis, quantity demanded on the bottom. Usually we'll just put in quantity because we'll have both supply and demand on the same graph. But I'm just making it clear that it's quantity demanded. It's telling you the quantity. So normally put price, y, quantity on the x. You notice here that I basically made a line going down, and we can notice an inverse relationship. And what does that mean? Well, as price increases, so the farther up the y-axis we go, basically the quantity that's going to be demanded decreases, and vice versa. As the price goes down, the quantity demanded increases. So we can see that happening with this graph. So we say that demand has an inverse relationship. As one goes up, the other goes down. Or it would have a negative slope as well. Notice these also demand curves. A demand curve does not have to be straight, and so we often do straight ones just for representation to show you what's happening, but they also can be curved. They can be curved inwards and outwards, so those are also demand curves, but typically we'll draw it as a straight line, but often they are curved. Okay, so that is demand. So now we're moving on to the next component. Actually, I'm just going to quickly go through a demand schedule. I haven't talked about that. These are just the different points on the graph. Just like you had your opportunity set with your budget constraint, this is a demand schedule with your prices and your quantity demanded, and use these points to plot all the points on a demand to make your demand curve. So that's what a demand schedule is. All right, now we'll go on to supply. So supply is how much a supplier is willing to supply at each price. So given the price, how much are they willing to basically produce? So quantity supplied is the total number of units supplied at that price. Remember, just like with demand, supply and quantity supplied are completely different. Supply is the whole line. Quantity supplied is just a point on the line, okay, at a specific price. So the law of supply says this: as the price increases, quantity supplied increases. As the price decreases, it should be quantity supplied decreases. So that's incorrect there. It should be quantity supplied decreases. Okay, so let's just correct that here for you. Okay, so quantity supplied decreases. And this makes sense because think about it. If someone at Starbucks is charging 50 cents for a coffee, well, they're not making a lot of money off of it. I'm not even sure they can cover all their expenses with that. Now, if they were to charge $100 for a cup of coffee, and I know that's extreme, but just think about it. There would be such a markup on there that they would be glad to, increase their production, 100-fold, 1,000-fold, whatever it is. They would have so much extra and they make so much money, they'd be willing to produce more. Of course, no one would demand $100 a cup of coffee, and so they wouldn't be able to sell any. And so it's this dynamic that essentially drives the price, but we'll get more into that with equilibrium. But what we're looking at now is that the higher the price, the more the supplier's incentive is to produce more. Okay, so if we look at it here, we also have a supply schedule, just like we have a demand schedule. We have price, same as demand schedule, and the quantity supplied. So often you'll see just one price, and then a column saying quantity demanded, quantity supplied, and you should be able to graph both of the graphs, the curves. So now, when we're looking at supply, we say that it has a positive slope. Why? As one goes up, the other goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down. So they move together. And just like with demand, you can have different shapes to it. It does not have to be a straight line. Okay, typically we draw it as a straight line, but typically they tend to be curved. Okay. Here we have everything together, so price, quantity demanded, quantity supplied, and we use that to draw basically our graphs. And so this is what we have here for a graph. Okay, so I have my demand, D1, and my supply, S1. And in this particular case, I didn't make them quite straight, but you notice they intersect at a certain point called E. E is called equilibrium. That's where demand is equal to supply. So when demand is equal to supply, that's called the equilibrium. Equilibrium means balance. Okay, so things are balanced, and that's essentially what happens in the market. If the supplier's charging too high a price, no one's buying it, so they're forced to reduce the price. Okay, if they lower the price too much, there's way too much of a demand. They're not willing to produce as much, and so then they drive their prices back up until we get a balance. And this balance happens naturally within the market, and that happens at a point called E. And so this happens over time. It's not instantaneous that they just go to E, but they make adjustments, and the market always changes too. And we'll talk about different reasons why things can change. So if we look at it, well, if we have too much supply, so say the supplier is charging too much money for the product. So we go back to $100 for a cup of coffee at Starbucks, ridiculous price. Well, they're able to supply a huge amount of it. At that price, they're making so much money, they'll supply a huge amount. However, the demand is next to nothing. I don't know anyone who would buy basically a $100 cup of coffee. Okay, so then the supplier's like, well, we're charging a really high price, but no one's buying it, so we're actually making nothing. So why don't we lower that price? They might try 50, 40, 30, 20, and suddenly the demand starts going up a little until they get back to maybe $6, $5, and then suddenly, they start getting more demand. Okay, so when they have the price too high, they have excess supply. They're not able to sell it. So in order to sell it, they have to lower the price. Okay. Now, on the other side, for consumers, if the price is too low, there's an excess demand. There's a shortage for things. So if you think about rent controls in New York or so, what happens? Well, the government controlled rent. So the price is lower than what it should be at equilibrium. So there's always a shortage. There's not an incentive for suppliers to put in new buildings because they're not making that much money. So essentially, they're not going to put in new buildings, and so there tends to be an excess demand or a shortage. So, less people are able to get it. And so what happens then is, suppliers might be increasing the price a little bit until it comes to an equilibrium. Because what happens is if, think there's a run on things, what happens? The prices tend to go up, If people are waiting out lined outside to buy, what was it, toilet paper during COVID, then essentially, they drive the prices up. And so the prices went up. And so that's essentially how it works until we get this equilibrium, this balance. Okay. So that is 3.1. The whole idea of supply and demand and equilibrium. And so next we will be going into 3.2, and we're going to be looking at shifting of demand and supply and how that looks. All right, that's it for now. I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.